In this video, I would like to turn my attention to the current ongoing political situation in France, specifically surrounding Emmanuel Macron, the current French president, Miss Marine Le Pen, and the overall effects of neoliberalism. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because the ongoing political situation in France is quite similar, at the very least, in my opinion, to the current ongoing situation we are currently dealing with here in America. Yes, very similar situations, although starkly different in many different ways that may seem obvious to some or many of you. So firstly, I just want to give you a quick rundown of what's recently went on in France. So France is currently having an election for president. So as far as I understand it, France, they vote on the president every 5 years. Last time they voted was in 2017. 2022, 5 years later, it's that time again. And so essentially the way French politics goes is the following, and I'll just give you a quick overview. So at least in my estimation, coming from an American outsider that's viewing all of this, their politics are a bit more democratic than ours here. They don't simply have two political parties that you are forced to choose from, even though they're both absolutely terrible. They have many. And some of those parties, specifically the left faction, is split up into many different factions, and they're very divided. And that's another similarity that they share here with us here in the U.S. But they do have places where they can voice their particular opinions. Like I said, it's more democratic, and the political system is different. But just to give you a quick rundown of what happened in the most recent election, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen have grabbed the top two spots in the French presidential election that was had on yesterday. Yesterday was Sunday, today is Monday. The incumbent president and far-right challenger move on to a top two runoff in 2 weeks. Jean Le Mélenchon, a close third. Everyone else is far behind, and Mr. Mélenchon is indeed the quote-unquote left-wing candidate, although left-wing is in parentheses here. There are many people on the ground in France that would disagree that he's not particularly left-wing enough. He's not really for a fundamental change of society, etc. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but like I said, they're divided among many things, just like many other people in politics in other countries, specifically ours, are also divided. Macron had around 28% of the vote, Le Pen around 23-24%, Mélenchon around 20%. And so as time went on, that actually developed a bit more. So Mélenchon was actually only like 500,000 votes behind Le Pen. So he almost beat her, and if he did, it would have been him and Mr. Macron in the runoff elections. And so the way it works is they have one election, it's about 11 or 12 candidates or so, and the top two that have the most votes, if no one gets over 50%, which has never happened in the history of French politics, they go on to have a runoff. Now, with all of that being said, I would like to talk about this because leading up to this election, there was a lot of hoopla about Mr. Emmanuel Macron being in the most precarious position he's ever been in. And by that, I mean, the question of him being reelected elected period, has never been in such question as it most recently was. And I want to talk about this because I can relate it to the political situation here at home because we're dealing with similar things. And the reason why the French people find themselves in such a very peculiar position, or specifically Mr. Macron, his lack of support these days, is caused by a particular ideology that he and many others champion around the world today. And that ideology is called neoliberalism. Now, I went and grabbed a definition of it that I thought would suffice for this video. And this definition comes from Mr. David Harvey, a man who's very astute, whose work I would recommend to anyone. And it goes as follows. This is how Mr. David Harvey characterizes neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a set of policies to use state power to restore employer profits by rolling back regulations and challenging unions. That was one of the best definitions I have come across, which is why I decided to use it. And I'll throw in a little caveat there. It's not only by rolling back regulations, but preserving the policies and different legislative wins by the working class, or not by the working class, by the business class that hurt the working class. Just a little caveat to throw in there. And what's essentially happened during Mr. Emmanuel Macron's reign as the French president is that he, through the ideology of neoliberalism, has waged economic warfare on the working class of the French population. And that is no understatement. And I'll just give you a couple of examples upon how this has occurred. But in order to do so, we have to understand him as a character and understand where he came from. And I'll just give you a brief introduction. So he was a part of the administration of Mr. Francois Hollande. Mr. Francois Hollande is a former president of France, and he defeated Mr. Nicolas Sarkozy back in 2012, I believe it was. And he was able to defeat Sarkozy, Mr. Hollande being a part of the Socialist Party of France, which is largely irrelevant now, and we'll get to that in just a second, because all Mr. Sarkozy had to offer the French people were austerity and pretty much nothing else. And so he got in basically running an anti-austerity campaign. Mr. Hollande, once he got in power, guess what he did? They imposed their own austerity. Yes, this is the Socialist Party of France. And once they did that, they basically committed political suicide. Well, fast forward to the rise of Mr. Emmanuel Macron. He separated from them. He created his own political party. Need I remind you, if you don't know, Mr. Macron used to self-identify as a socialist, although in name only. Nothing else about him speaks socialist in any bit of the word, in any sense of the word. But he abandoned that among many other things, and he created his center-left party. And he ran as a middle-of-the-road kind of politician. And he won on that platform, and he was successful. But he was successful basically on a whim. He kind of mistook his way into the presidency. He only won because the other challenger that was projected to win underwent some kind of great scandal, giving his family government positions or something of the sort. I'm not really too familiar with it. But nevertheless, Mr. Macron became the president of France. And in imposing neoliberalism and holding true to its definition, he did the following things. He had the peculiar decision, he made the peculiar decision to impose a fuel tax, a gas tax on the French people. And his justification for it was to help the ecological problem crisis that we all face here. We all know what it is. It doesn't need to be hashed out. It was for environmentalism efforts. Well, the people of France aren't stupid. They realize what this is. He wants to screw over the working people of France who have already suffered so greatly, especially due to the crash that was in 2008, and many of them have never really recovered. And he wants to do so on the backs of the working people of France, while coming out with this faux idea of somehow saving the environment while doing so. Now look, the people of France are sympathetic to the environment and all those different issues that pertain to it, but you're not going to do this to them while you shovel money to the owner class. No. So, well, they took to the streets like the French do. They have long socialist and revolutionary traditions, and they raised hell. And he rescinded the policy. He was embarrassed, and he rescinded the policy. Now, fast forward a bit more, he had another bright idea. He decided to attack the pensions of the French working class, which they fought so very hard for. The pensions in France, if you aren't aware, they're pretty generous to those people because the working class fought for them, and they deserve them, and they won on that particular issue. Well, there are about 42 different pension schemes in France, and Emmanuel Macron decided, you know what, we need to consolidate this. I think an overhaul was the word that they used for it. We're going to turn 42 into 1, 2, or 3 different pension systems. Well, that's not really what he meant. He wanted to take away from their pensions. He wanted to destroy them, have them eroded. He wanted to raise the age of retirement from 62, I believe it is, to 64. And they saw this for what it is. And the union leaders in France, along with the students and the working class and those yellow vests that you heard so much about, they came out and they induced an indefinite general strike. And once again, Mr. Macron was embarrassed. Any kind of trust he had left among the people was lost, and he rescinded the idea once again. Now, in telling you all of this, I know that was a bit of a mouthful, but the point is that when you look at challengers, far-right, fascistic leaders like Ms. Marine Le Pen that champions this anti-immigration, anti-EU, she's against NATO, and a lot of the things she has to say about NATO I actually agree with somewhat. But this blaming of the EU, this blaming of the immigrants that have close to nothing as to be the reason for the problems of the French people. Of course, she does give word salad to some of their grievances, and that might make her a savory character to some of the people on the ground in France. But nevertheless, people like her, among many others, are only able to rise because of not specifically what they're doing, but what the leading politician and politicians, specifically Mr. Emmanuel Macron, are doing and alienating the French people and making it easier for them to drift towards characters like Marine Le Pen and many others that are all trying to play the blame game. It's kind of like what's going on here in the United States, and this is where I draw the similarity. We have Joe Biden, much like a figure of Emmanuel Macron, one that champions that ideology of neoliberalism, and he's imposing it on us right now as we see it. We're in a COVID-19 pandemic. Many people are struggling. They have yet to recover from the economic downturn of 2020 and 2021. And what are we getting from our government? Austerity. And if you look at the polls, the Republicans are meant to make a comeback. Donald Trump is on the rise once again, and that sentiment for a right-wing shift in this great country of America seems inevitable at this point. So, in conclusion, the situation that's going on in France isn't much different from the one that's going on here in the US, and there are obvious reasons as to why. And will those reasons be dealt with? I guess we'll just have to wait and see.